First, I just want to thank you guys for being here, listening to my presentation today. Like I said, it's an informative speech from my Communications and Christians Ministry class, 542. We'll be talking about domestic violence. Cool. Change the slide. As ministers, counselors, and human service professionals, there's a near certain likelihood that you will at some point in your career come in contact with someone who's been involved with domestic violence. Whether a victim, a witness, or an offender, perhaps you may even experience these roles yourself. It's almost a certainty you'll come in contact with somebody who's been involved. Domestic violence creates one of the most dangerous environments for a family and remains one of the most potentially damaging events for a family's health. Because domestic violence is such a common yet dangerous reality, it's important to be aware of what it is, how it happens, and recognizing signs of its occurrence, so that as a minister or a human service professional, we can be effective in helping. Today we're going to cover 3 main points. What is domestic violence? We'll define it and discuss its participants, how it happens in the cycle of violence, and how to recognize it in the evidence of abuse. What is domestic violence? Violence and emotional abuse used by one person in a relationship to control another. Behaviors to include verbal abuse, keeping a partner from seeing family and friends, withholding finances, actual or threatened physical assault, sexual assault, stalking, and intimidation. Although emotional, psychological, and financial abuses are not criminal behaviors, it is still considered domestic violence. A great number of domestic violence cases involve physical harm, but just remember that it can occur in a lot of different forms. So who are the victims of domestic violence? Domestic violence crosses all racial and socioeconomic backgrounds. It's not limited by the participant's role or the position in the family. Any member of a particular relationship can abuse any other member for any reason. Although many consider women as the only victims of abuse, the reality is that anyone can be a victim. However, the vast majority of victims are women and children. Every 9 seconds in the United States, a woman is beaten or assaulted. Domestic violence is the leading cause of injury to women, even more than car accidents, muggings, and rapes combined. Studies also show that an estimated 10 million children witness domestic violence annually. Studies also show that men who as children observe their fathers abuse their mothers are twice as likely to abuse their own wives. Approximately half of children who either witness domestic violence or become victims themselves develop emotional and behavioral problems by the clinical age and require behavioral health services. Alright, so how does domestic violence happen? We're going to talk about the cycle of violence. The cycle of violence is a widely accepted theory developed by Lenore Walker with 3 distinct stages within the abusive relationship. The first one is the tension building, the second one is acute battery, and third is the honeymoon phase. So what is tension building? It's kind of self-explanatory. In this phase is where the tension is not only present, but it's also between the aggressor and the victim, but it's also been building possibly for a long time. In some cases, the victim reports walking on eggshells to avoid a confrontation. It's that kind of tension. This is by far the longest stage in the cycle and can last from hours to months to even years. The abuser is becoming more angry, irritable, and aggressive. Verbal outbursts may be a sign of a coming aggression, and arguing is prevalent in this stage. The victim may attempt to withdraw for a period of time or attempt to be too nurturing to the offender in hopes of diffusing the situation. This eventually becomes futile, and the victim cannot meet the offender's unrealistic demands. All right, the next stage, the acute battering phase. This is the stage of the cycle in which the violence actually occurs. Again, it's most commonly a physical assault, but it can be any number of violent actions. The aggressor explodes, having convinced themselves that violence was justified. Actions may range from shoving, pushing, hitting, even sexual abuse, torture, and in the worst case, homicide. Even without a physical attack, intimidation, threats with a weapon are also commonplace in domestic violence. Property may be destroyed, as well as harm to pets. Typically, the police are called during this stage. It's obviously the most dangerous stage because of its violent nature. Normally, the aggressor is angry and the victim is fearful. And let me just give a note here about past abusers. In some cases, after the tension has been building for so long, and the victim knows what's coming, whether consciously or subconsciously, they almost provoke the attack to get it over with because they know it's coming. The next stage is the honeymoon phase. This phase is marked by denial or minimization of the violence that's just occurred. It's followed by apologies and promises of it never happening again. Here the aggressor expresses regret about the damages to person or property, but may also deny responsibility in an attempt to just further themselves from the incident. Sometimes the victim is even rewarded, as awkward as that sounds, for being abused, because this may be the only time in the relationship where the victim is treated well. Although the victim wants to believe the violence is over, they still remain in a state of fear. If the police were called back in the acute battering phase, this phase is probably when they arrive, and both parties are normally reluctant to talk about it by that point because they're into the honeymoon phase. For prolonged abusive relationships, the honeymoon phase may simply just be a time where violence is not occurring. They've been in it for so long and so much abuse that for them the honeymoon phase is just a time when there's no violence. All right. So how do we recognize violence, domestic violence in others? Whether as human service professionals or as a co-worker or a friend, there are signs to look for where potential abuse may be occurring. There's two kinds of abuse. There's physical and there's emotional. So let's talk about that. First is the physical warning signs. Obviously physical injury, bruises, look like they came from choking or punching, black eyes, nose, even bruises on the arms. In particular, on the lower arms, it could come from defensive marks, on the upper arms from being grabbed or dragged around. Another sign is attempting to hide those same injuries, literally, with clothes and cover-up or makeup or whatever. It's also hidden through making unrealistic excuses for them. I'm sure you guys have heard those before, and you see a bruise and you ask, and it's some crazy, unbelievable answer, and that's a sign of cover-up. A victim may only have a few close friends and seems isolated from relatives and is prevented from making new ones. The victim always having to ask permission from their significant other to meet or talk or do things with other people. These are all signs. Then we have emotional and behavioral signs. Low self-esteem, drug or alcohol abuse problems, depression, hopelessness, loss of interest in normal activities. Talking, this is a really good one, talking about their partner's temper and anger issues, but stopping just short of talking about the abuse. If that's something that's common in conversation, then that may be a sign that there's something going on. And then suicide or attempted suicide, that's always another sign. So in conclusion, domestic violence is a serious matter and dangerous in many ways for many participants. Continues to affect more and more families every year, and the damage it causes can be devastating both physically and emotionally. It's important to understand what it is, how it happens, and why it perpetuates, and to learn to recognize signs as they occur around you. Understanding and recognition of violence as it occurs will help the human service professional serve and minister more effectively and precisely. The earlier the abuse is acknowledged, the earlier it can hopefully be stopped. Thank you for your time. I hope this was informational.
Thank you.